Thank you everyone for joining. Like Angela said, this is the presentation for the Ore Knob Mine Superfund site for the proposed plan for operable Unit 2. If you do have questions, feel free to put it in the chat. We will go over everything at the end, all the questions in the chat. If there is something you want me to clarify, raise your hand and hopefully we are able to see it in time, are able to unmute you, or you can put it in the chat and Angela can see it come on screen so I can catch her and try to clarify what I said that might have not been clear enough. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to go over the site location. I'm sure most of you know, but the site is located in Ashe County, North Carolina. Here are a few figures to give you an idea of where the site is within Ashe County. And we see that the Ore Knob former mine site is near Jefferson and West Jefferson cities within North Carolina. So before we get into the background and details about the site, I do want to give a brief overview of the Superfund process. So Superfund sites are discovered when the presence of hazardous waste is made known to EPA. Once a site is identified, all existing information is reviewed, then the site is inspected to determine its history and effects on the population and the environment. Information collected during the assessment phase is used to score the site according to the danger posed to human health and the environment. If a site has a high enough score and meets all other criteria, it will be placed on the national priorities list. Once on the list, the remedial investigation, or RI, begins. This involves gathering and analyzing numerous samples of soil, surface water, groundwater, sediment, or waste from locations throughout the site. This investigation also involves assessing risks that are posed by the site. Then potential cleanup alternatives are developed and analyzed in the feasibility study, or the FS. After the cleanup alternatives are developed, the option considered best for the site is proposed to the community for evaluation and comment. The option considered best for the site is proposed to the community for evaluation and comment in a proposed plan. This is where Ore Knob Mine site is currently in the Superfund process. A responsiveness summary of the public comments will be created once the public comment period ends. Public comments can change the course of action for the site, so it is important to submit any comments you may have. The cleanup method that is ultimately selected for the site, along with the reasons for its selection, are set forth in a record of decision that will be created after the public comments have been addressed. From there, the remedy will be designed and implemented during the remedial design and remedial action, respectively. Upon completion of the remedial action, long-term monitoring or 5-year reviews will continue until unlimited use and unrestricted exposure is achieved. So for Ore Knob Mine site, we have separated the site into 2 operable units, or as we like to call them, OUs. So we have OU1, which addresses groundwater, and OU2, which addresses surface water and sediment. I'm sure most of you are familiar with OU1. In 2010, EPA installed around 20 residential water treatment systems with water softeners to remove manganese and cobalt. For this proposed plan, we are focusing on OU2. The purpose of this proposed plan is to choose an interim action that will restore water quality by reducing the amount of metals, acidity, and sulfate discharged from Ore Knob Branch and Little Peak Creek to downstream receiving waters of Peak Creek and South Fork New River. If you have questions related to groundwater or OU1, please feel free to reach out to us outside of this meeting, and we will be happy to discuss your questions. So now to get into some site background and history. This was a copper ore mining site from the 1850s to 1962, and there were 2 main periods and areas of mining. From 1873 to 1883, there was mining at the base of Ordnance Branch. And if you can look at this figure, the first area of mining is the red circle on the bottom right-hand corner, or the bottom right-hand red circle. And then from 1957 to 1962, there was mining plus a mill and processing area at the base of Little Peak Creek, which is the red circle and the bottom left red circle. I'm also going to take this moment to point out the watersheds of interest, and then get my laser pointer. So we have Ordnance Branch, which starts right around here and flows up to here. We have Little Peak Creek, which starts right here and flows all the way up this way. Peak Creek meets Ordnance Branch right here and flows up over here. And then we also have South Fork New River, which is barely on this figure, but it is this squiggly river at the top. So we know it's an old mining site, but how did it get contaminated? So initially, the ore was processed using a Hunt and Douglas process, and that consists of crushing and extraction by roasting and leaching the ore in an acidic solution, and then recovery by cementation. And these techniques produce piles of rock and waste rock and potentially contaminated soils from roast yards, smelter slag, and other wastes. And then when our second group, Appalachian Sulfides, Inc., from 1952 to 1962, came and explored Ore Knob, they decided to produce copper concentrates. And their operations included sinking new production shafts and expanding the underground workings. And their process of getting the ore involved flotation separation, which developed tailings. And these tailings were deposited in two areas. One of the areas was a smaller area, and it was down gradient from the mill. And if you remember from our previous figure, the mill was near Little Peak Creek. So we had a smaller area that the tailings were impounded right off of Little Peak Creek. And then most of their tailings were located on Ordnance Branch, which is still located there. We have a main tailings impoundment right located on Ordnance Branch. And so these waste from site operations and mining related activities have affected downstream surface waters, sediment, and floodplain soils. So I do want to touch on some previous actions that have happened with these watersheds. And from 1992 to 1995, the state of North Carolina conducted a Clean Water Act project, and they constructed anoxic limestone drains to try to address the acidity of this mine-influenced water. And these ALDs, as we refer to them, are at the base of Ordnance Branch. Also, EPA conducted a time-critical removal action from 2008 to 2011. And the purpose of this was to stabilize the tailings impoundment. However, prior to the EPA conducting this removal action, there was an estimated 30,000 cubic yards of tailings that eroded from this tailings impoundment and were deposited downstream of Ordnance Branch. During this removal action, EPA also excavated tailings located west of Little Peak Creek. We mentioned previously that during the Superfund process, when sites are being investigated, they are also assessed for risks. For this site, we have found no risks for human health, but we have found for Ordnance Branch and Little Peak Creek in surface water and sediment, and for Peak Creek in surface water, that they contain contaminants of concern, or COCs, at concentrations that pose an ecological risk. At this point, South Fork New River does not pose any human health or ecological risks. And the purpose of this action is to continue to protect the surface water and sediment resources in that river, and to the extent possible, to improve water and sediment quality in Little Peak Creek and Ordnance Branch to permit natural restoration of their ecological function. So this slide gives us a little bit of overview of each watershed and what the contaminants of concern or the COCs are, and if known, what are the contaminant source. So we do know that Ornaw Branch is our most affected watershed of the three. And we can see for the surface water of Ornaw Branch, our main contaminant source is the tailings impoundment. And this comes from the water leaching into our tailings impoundment and becoming contaminated through our tailings and seeping into our watershed. And so that's how our tailings impoundment impacts our surface water. We also have our ALDs, or just to remind you, our anoxic limestone drain outlets as a contaminant source. And those are those ALDs that the state installed back in the 90s. For sediment, we can see the contaminant sources include a sawmill dam, which is a small dam that was formed about halfway down Ornaw Branch by sawn lumber that impounds iron-rich sediment. The sediment contaminant source also includes those 30,000 cubic yards of tailings that eroded prior to the EPA removal action that we mentioned earlier. Some of those tailings are located along the stream bank above the water level and downstream Ornaw Branch. And if that stream bank were to erode into the watershed, it would cause Ornaw Branch to exceed screening levels for metals outside of its current COCs. So that is something that we touch on in our remedy alternatives that we'll discuss in a few slides. Here's some more information for Little Peak Creek and Peak Creek. The contaminant source for Little Peak Creek isn't as evident as it is for Ornaw Branch, but it is believed that the contaminant source is the contaminated sediment from within the former freshwater pond. And for Peak Creek, we know that the contamination source is from receiving the contaminated surface water from Ornaw Branch. So now we can get into the alternatives that were developed during our feasibility study. So we'll have alternatives for Ornaw Branch surface water, Ornaw Branch sediment, Little Peak Creek surface water, and Little Peak Creek sediment. There will be about 4 to 5 alternatives for each of these mediums. And with all of these options, we will have an alternative one of no action, because that is required for us to have an alternative that is no action. But I'll briefly go over all these alternatives and give a very basic overview of what each alternative entails. So for the Ornaw Branch surface water, for alternative 2, it's active treatment, which would involve the surface water for Ornaw Branch and Little Peak Creek being pumped into a water treatment plant. We have alternative 3A, which would be the surface water of Ornaw Branch being treated with a passive biochemical process at multiple locations. Alternative 3B is the same passive biochemical process as alternative 3A, but it would only be at one location. Alternative 4 is identical to alternative 3B, but it would include source control. And that sourcing control would be applied by spray or drip irrigation on the tailings impoundment. And that would be a combination of bactericides or chemical reductants to try to control the water coming off of the tailings impoundment. And then alternative 5 is passive treatment with source removal. So it is the same passive biochemical process at one location, and that would rely on removing the tailings impoundment. Now we're going to go over the Ornaw sediment alternatives. Again, we have alternative 1 as no action. Alternative 2 would be complete sediment removal. So that's removing the sediment and chemical precipitates that could potentially recontaminate surface water, and we would replace that with clean sediment. Alternative 3 would be selective sediment removal, so removing contaminated sediment and chemical precipitates from selected reaches and replace it with clean sediment. Alternative 4 is the same as alternative 3, except it would include stabilizing the stream banks to prevent erosion of tailings impacted floodplain soil. So that kind of goes back to those tailings that I mentioned a few slides earlier that are above the water level. And if they were to erode into the watershed, it would cause more COCs than are currently in or not branch. So this alternative does address those floodplain soils that are impacted by the tailings. And alternative 5, we have selective sediment removal with capping. So that means half of the contaminated sediment and chemical precipitates would be removed and half of them would be capped in place. And then we would also stabilize the stream banks to prevent erosions of the tailings impacted floodplain soil. And now we get into the Little Peak Creek surface water alternatives. They're very similar to the ore knob. So active treatment is the same for alternative 2. It's pumping the surface water from Ore Knob Branch and Little Peak Creek into a water treatment plant. The passive treatment is using the same passive biochemical process, but at one location at Little Peak Creek. Alternative 4 would be passive treatment, but with an anoxic limestone drain or an ALD at one location, and would also rely on source control. And that would be those contaminated sediments within the former freshwater pond. It would rely on stopping acid generation and improve the quality of discharge water from the former freshwater ponds. Alternative 5 is monitored natural attenuation with source removal. So the source removal would involve removing the contaminated sediment within the former freshwater pond. And natural attenuation is the process that includes a variety of physical, chemical, or biological mechanisms that, under favorable conditions, act without human intervention to reduce contaminant mass. And then monitored means that we'll be occasionally checking and sampling the water to make sure that the contaminant mass is reducing. And finally, the Little Peak Creek sediment alternatives. Again, they're very similar to the Ore Knob Branch sediment alternatives. We have complete sediment removal, which is, again, completely removing the sediment and chemical precipitates that could potentially recontaminate the surface water and replace it with clean sediment. Selective sediment removal, which is removing the contaminated sediment and chemical precipitates from selected reaches, replaced with clean sediment. And then selective sediment removal with capping, remove some of the contaminated sediment and chemical precipitates, and then install caps over the other contaminated sediment in selected reaches. So I wanted to give us a chance to look at and compare the costs of all these alternatives. And I know we have a few numbers on the screen, so I wanted to go over them very quickly. We have the capital cost, which is really, the cost up front and how much it would cost to originally install the remedy. We have the total NPW O&M, which is the total net present worth, operation and maintenance. And operation and maintenance really means how much it would cost every year to operate and maintain this remedy. And net present worth basically means for the lifetime of this remedy, how much would it cost to maintain it? And so what I really like to look at is the total cost when I'm comparing these alternatives. And we do have, the EPA has a proposed remedy. And so I want to point that out for you so that you can look at that cost compared to the other alternative costs. So for the Ore Knob Branch surface water alternatives, the proposed remedy is alternative 3A, passive treatment at multiple locations. And the total cost for that remedy is just over $26.5 million. For the Ore Knob Branch sediment alternative, the proposed remedy is alternative 4, selective sediment removal with the floodplain stabilization, and that remedy is just under $3 million. For the Little Peak Creek surface water alternative, the proposed remedy is passive treatment, and that's just over $13.5 million. I also want to point out here that the active treatment, this cost is included as part of the Ore Knob surface water cost. So if we go back to the or knob alternative 2, that price was around $95 million, just as a reminder. And then we have Little Peak Creek sediment alternative, and the proposed remedy is alternative 3, selective sediment removal, which is just over $1 million. In order to decide the preferred remedy, there are numerous criteria used to evaluate the alternatives, including cost, protectiveness, implementability, and others. And so this is the preferred remedy that the EPA has come up with. So we have a preferred remedy for the Or Knob Branch surface water sediment and Little Peak Creek surface water and sediment. I did add up all those costs together so we could see the total cost for the entire remedy of the site for OU2. And so the total cost would be for $44,773,200. So that is the total cost for Or Knob and Little Peak Creek. So I want to take this moment to kind of explain further what our proposed remedy is going to look like and what further details it has. And I'm going to turn and look at this screen because it has a little bit more detail. So to focus on our surface water, we do have our passive treatment. Our preferred remedy is a passive treatment with biochemical treatment at multiple locations. So when we say biochemical treatment, what we're discussing is the biochemical reactor cells. And a biochemical reactor works by using organic material to reduce the acidity. So the preferred remedy shows installing 2 anaerobic, and anaerobic means without oxygen. So 2 anaerobic biochemical reactor cells up here at the top, right at the outlet of these ALDs, or anoxic limestone drains. And just a reminder, those are the anoxic limestone drains that were installed by the state in the 90s. So we would have 2 anoxic limestone drains installed right at those outlets, and then we'll have 2 larger anaerobic BCRs installed at the base of the main tailings impoundment. And BCRs come in a system. They work best in a system. So when you have a BCR, you'll always have an aerobic pond, which means an oxygenated pond, followed by a manganese rock filter. And then if you see this figure continues over here, there's a final polished pond. So that is the system that comes with a BCR. And this manganese rock filter, it's a little confusing. It's actually a rock filter made of limestone that filters out manganese. So it's not made of manganese, it's a confusing name. It's a rock filter made of limestone that filters out manganese. In addition to the BCR system that the surface water remedy includes, there will also be a passive reactive barrier that will be installed along the tailings impoundment with the watershed. And the purpose of this passive reactive barrier is to help clean up any contaminated groundwater that's going to recharge into our watershed. So that way we don't have to worry about, cleaning up the water here at this anaerobic BCR, it coming into the tailings impoundment and then getting recharged with contaminated groundwater. So we do have this passive reactive barrier to clean up any seeps of contaminated groundwater coming into the watershed. There will also be cap repair. And with this cap repair, we will also be reseeding any bare spots on the tailings impoundment, just to ensure that it is sturdy. There will also be bypasses and diversion channels made for unimpacted storm water. So during rain events, any unimpacted and uncontaminated stormwater can divert the cleanup system, and that way we don't overdo the cleanup system. This unimpacted water will go around the cleanup system and can join the watershed after the BCR system. And then we also have a few cross channels over our tailings impoundment, and those cross channels will be lined with an impermeable liner. And that's to ensure, again, if there is rainwater, that it won't become contaminated with the tailings over the tailings impoundment. So that's pretty much it with our surface water remedy. For the sediment, we have selective sediment removal with stabilization. So that means in select reaches, we will be removing the sediment and replacing it with clean sediment. The contaminated sediment that we do remove will be added to this tailings impoundment. So we'll be adding it to the tailings impoundment. And so that will obviously happen before our cap repair. And then, as we mentioned, we had the floodplain stabilization. So the soil stabilization will include placement of riprap, enhanced vegetation, or possibly even channel modifications to alter the flow, just to ensure that the soil sorry, I lost my mouse, the soil and downstream ore knob, which is right over here, that there won't be a possibility that it will erode and further contaminate ore knob branch. So we'll move on to the preferred remedy for Little Peak Creek. And the preferred remedy is really very similar. The only thing is we don't have the tailings impoundment to worry about, so it's a little bit more simple. But the preferred remedy, again, has the passive treatment with biochemical treatment. So that includes, again, we have our anaerobic BCRs, followed by our aerobic or oxygenated ponds, followed by our manganese rock filter and our final polish pond. And you'll see that our BCRs and our rock filter are right over, if you see this black outline, that is our former freshwater pond. And if you can remember, that is what is believed is the contaminant source for Little Peak Creek. So we do plan on removing that contaminant source by installing our rock filter and our BCR. So when we install this rock filter and BCR, we will be removing that contaminated sediment within the former freshwater ponds. We will also be including in the surface water remedy, again, a stormwater runoff and a diversion channel. And then again, our sediment is selective sediment removal. So there will be selected reaches along this watershed where contaminated sediment and chemical precipitates will be removed. For Little Peak Creek, the contaminated sediment that is removed from the former freshwater pond and from the sediment remedy will be disposed of in a lined depository that will be right here, if you can see that. So that is where we are planning on keeping our contaminated sediment. Sorry. So that's pretty much it for our preferred remedy for Arnott Branch and Little Peak Creek. So the EPA is proposing to use a phased approach to clean up these watersheds, and that will be beginning at the upstream end of the contaminated area and working downstream. Phase 1 should take about 2 years of construction and then will be followed up by monitoring until it meets the performance measures that have been set for Phase 1. This is estimated to take 5 years of monitoring until Phase 2 can begin, but it is possible the metrics may be met quicker than the 5-year timeline. During Phase 1, passive treatment will be used to address contaminated water upstream of the main tailings impoundment in Arnott Branch. Once Phase 1 remedy components were shown to be operational and achieving the metrics established for them, then construction for Phase 2 will begin. And that is estimated to also take about 2 years. Phase 2 will take additional surface water treatment measures in Arnott Branch to further reduce metals traveling to Peak Creek. It will include source control and surface water treatment measures in Little Peak Creek. Water quality, sediment quality, and biological metrics will be monitored for a period of 5 years following completion of the Phase 1 and 2 actions to determine if Phase 3 actions are warranted in order to fully meet the goals set for OU2. If necessary, Phase 3 will consist of 1 year of construction and would take additional measures downstream of Arnott Branch and Little Peak Creek. A phased cleanup is very beneficial if there are any funding restrictions. This way, phases can be completed as funding is made available. So here are some next steps and estimated dates. We do expect to have the final remedy decision by August of this year, and hopefully have the remedial design planned June of 2025 to June of 2026, and start the remedial action in June of 2026. However, the design and cleanup work is really dependent on funding, so those dates are potentially going to change dependent on funding. As mentioned before, community engagement is important in the Superfund process for choosing the remedy for cleanup. This is your community, so I want to be sure that your voice is heard. The 30-day comment period will end on June 5th, so please get any comments you have in by that date, either by the email listed or by mail. You can find all the information that EPA has on the site, including the proposed plan, feasibility study, risk assessments, etc. And that's all available on the administrative record, which is available on the website listed. I do believe that's the website you went to register for this meeting. So hopefully you're familiar with it. But that is it for this presentation. If you have any questions about the site outside of this presentation, outside of this Q&A, please feel free to contact me. Again, my name is Megan, and I'm the Remedial Project Manager, and that's my contact information. I also have Angela, who's the Community Involvement Coordinator for the EPA, her contact information, and Beth, who is the Project Manager for the state, and her contact information. And here we mentioned we have Randy, who is the previous project manager, who has a ton of information on the site as well. So if there are any questions, happy to address them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. Great presentation.
Yeah, great presentation, Megan. Thank you.
Thanks.
We had a few questions in the chat, but I believe that I answered them.
Okay.
But in case people can't see them in the chat, let me, somebody asked if the meeting would be recorded, and the answer is yes. It's actually being recorded now. We will turn it into a YouTube video and place on the website. That takes, I checked today, that takes about a week or so to get that done. So we'll try to get that up, posted as soon as possible. The other question is, are these costs over a certain period of time? And I think you answered that with your the phased plan approach. So it is over time. And he asked, what's the time period? And I think you had a slide that showed the different phases. He said,
Yeah.
thank you. So
do you want me to go into that more, or?
Yeah, Mr. Copeland, do you want her to go into that a little bit more? He asked before you went into it.
Okay.
So, and I messaged, that you were explaining it then, but if Mr. Copeland, and y'all, you can take yourself off mute. You can come on camera. Whatever y'all want to do. If you have further questions regarding that. Okay, somebody's asking, Megan, if you could put the timetable in a different format. Specifically, it all went very well. When could the Little Peak Creek portion start? If all went very well, when could the Little Peak Creek portion start?
Okay. I saw Mr. Copeland came on camera, so I want to give him an opportunity, and then I can address the Little Peak Creek.
I'm muted.
There you are.
Oh, there we go. No, thank you. I think your presentation covered my question. So
Okay.
Good.
I can look at that again in the documents as well.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest, if you're interested, the feasibility study really goes into detail, and they have a great graph on the timeline as well, which I thought about putting in here, but there was already so much information. I didn't want to overwhelm everyone.
Yeah.
But to address the Little Peak Creek question, if everything goes to plan, Little Peak Creek construction will start in phase 2. So the construction will be completed 9 years after design starts. After remedial action starts. So if remedial action were to start June of 2026, we would have 2 years of constructing phase 1, followed by 5 years of monitoring, and then 2 years of constructing phase 2. And that's when Little Peak Creek construction will start. So that would be 26, 28 plus 5 years,
Yeah.
which would be 2033 would be construction starting of Little Peak Creek if everything went well. And the hope would be for funding that we would get all the funding up front. I don't know if that's plausible, but that would be an idealistic situation. But the great thing, like we mentioned with phases, is that we can get funding in phases. And so we can start the first phase and start to clean up the site in bite-sized pieces.
Right. Do we have any? We do have another question. How do I get on the mailing list? I believe I just need Angela's email address. Yes. Just send me an email, miller.angela@epa.gov. And I think Megan has a slide. Yes. And we will be, updating as we get information on the site. We'll be doing, and I'm also doing starting an email list as well. So, we'll be mailing out and doing some email. Once the record of decision is signed, we'll go back out and let everyone know that it's been signed and that it's available on the website. And I know sometimes the websites can be a little challenging at times. We try to make it as easy as possible. But if you ever have issues trying to find a report, just please contact Megan and I. We're happy to help you. If the report's not that big, we could always send it. So please feel free to reach out if you can't find something that you're looking for, especially during the comment period. And any other questions, it never fails. As soon as we press end, you have questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's what we're here for. Okay, we've got a question from Stephen. Go ahead.
So even though I live on Little Pig Creek, I have probably 1/3 of a mile of the creek. This sounds pretty far off, 2033, but I assume from the map, one of the places you'll be moving sediment is along my property. But even though this is futuristic, you'll let us know before like an excavator shows up, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Matter of fact, when we get to, when we have a remedial design, before we get to the remedial action, we will come back out to the public to say, hey, this is what we're going to be doing. Because at that point, Megan gave you a lot of details tonight, but at that point, we have even more specific details from the remedial design. So we'll be coming back out to the community at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, maybe Angela, as a follow-up to that, when it comes to needing to get on someone's private property, we come to the property owner and formalize an access agreement to make sure that we're all clear and that we have permission to be on the property.
Yeah, we would never enter somebody's property without their permission. Any more questions? I know a lot of you I talk to at least once a year to schedule your sampling. I'm excited to meet everybody tonight. This also, we have a court reporter on it. She's transcribing everything, and your questions, your comments, those are being recorded tonight as well. So those will also be part of the record of decision. So I'll give everybody one more opportunity to ask questions. We'll give you back your life. Give you back your night. If nobody has any other questions. Again, it's going to be recorded. Well, it has been recorded. We'll turn it into a YouTube video. It'll take us about a week and we'll get that posted. I know that there's also an HOA up there. I've talked with Sandy and I can let her know when the video is available and she can get it out to the HOA. There's all kinds of ways that I can let y'all know when it's ready and available. And if I have your email address, I'd love to send you a message to say it's up and going. So, and then your comments, again, remember they need to be in by the 5th. If you're mailing it in, it needs to be postmarked by the 5th. That is my birthday, so you can put a birthday card in there. I'm fine with that. I'm okay. I love Amazon gift cards. I'm fine with that. Just put that in the envelope and have it postmarked. And there's Megan's email address. You can just email her your comment. Or if you still like putting stamps on envelopes, you can do that too. There's Megan's mailing address. But I don't see any more questions in the chat. And I do not see any hands raised. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your time. Again, any questions that you have, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We want you to be able to understand what we presented, and sometimes it kind of takes a minute to process it all. So feel free to join us or reach out to us. And thank you again so much for joining us. Until next time.